On Primetime Politics tonight, new reports from Canada's Auditor General highlight failings of the federal government's pandemic response at the border for temporary foreign workers and for small businesses. Auditor General Karen Hogan will be here with her findings. Feeding your family is about to get a whole lot more expensive as food prices head for the highest increases on record. We'll look at what's about to spike and why. And our panel of party commentators on the spiking cost of living and the latest Auditor General's findings on those failed border measures. And we'll begin tonight with the latest reports from Canada's Auditor General focused on the federal government's response to the pandemic. Let's start with border measures. The Auditor General found that at the outset of the pandemic, the Public Health Agency of Canada was unable to confirm whether more than two-thirds of travellers arriving in Canada complied with quarantine orders. Over the next year, that number dropped to 37%, so it did get better. And on test results, problems there too. The Public Health Agency unable to match or couldn't locate test results for 30% of the travellers arriving in Canada between February and June of this year. And on top of that, the agency had no way to confirm whether those required to quarantine in government hotels actually did so. The auditor also found government inspections aimed at protecting temporary foreign workers in the agriculture sector were a failure and needed an immediate fix. Even when warned about the shortcomings of the inspections, the results actually got worse. The Auditor General also found that government programs designed to protect the food supply during the pandemic did work, but in some cases were administered unfairly across the country. And there is still no national crisis plan to protect the entire food system. And finally, the pandemic program to deliver financial assistance to small business was called the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund. It lacked efficiency, fairness, and transparency, so that some businesses who didn't meet the rules got money and others were refused money because the rules were applied differently in different regions of the country. And I'm joined now by Canada's Auditor General, Karen Hogan. Thanks for joining me to discuss your reports. Let's begin with your findings on the border control measures during the pandemic. And of course, we still have some of them in place. They're designed to protect Canadians from the spread of the virus. Can you say, based on your audits, whether those border measures have put Canadians at risk?
So it's nice to be here. Thank you. So this was a second audit that we did on border measures. We followed up from an audit in March, and we wanted to see whether or not the Public Health Agency had improved on its ability to track and monitor incoming travelers to ensure that they were properly quarantining. And then we also looked at COVID-19 testing and mandatory hotel stays. Mm-hmm. And really, in many instances, we found that the department was unable to tell you or I whether or not the measures put in place were effective. And this was mostly because they had problems tracking and monitoring and following up.
All right. I mean, so if you put sort of two and two together here, if they aren't able to say whether they were effective, one might assume that there is some risk involved then to Canadians because they can't tell us whether the measures worked.
Well, I know that as a rule, I think Canadians are really good rule followers, and I trust and expect that everyone will continue to do right. But what we were looking at was not whether or not Canadians were following health guidance and the rules at the border, but whether or not the department was able to demonstrate that the orders that they had put in place were effective at helping to stop spreading the virus. Yeah. And they were really unable to tell us that.
I think that's the key, isn't it? I mean, Canadians may be rule followers, but there's no way of telling whether they followed the rules in all cases. I mean, that's what your findings suggest, correct?
That is it.
Okay. The Public Health Agency, let's drill down a little bit. The Public Health Agency had records to verify hotel stays for only 25% of travelers arriving in Canada. It referred those travelers to law enforcement for follow-up, but didn't know the outcome of 60% of those referrals. How come?
I think this is just part of, many of the findings that we saw in the border measures is that the agency hadn't really thought through how to monitor and enforce all of the requirements. And so we had the same findings back in March, that individuals that they thought were at high risk of not complying were referred to law enforcement. Mm-hmm. However, they didn't follow up. And so, at times law enforcement would come back to the agency, but the agency really is just unaware of whether or not people quarantined as they did, whether they stayed at the hotels as they were supposed to, and then obviously it leads you to the conclusion of whether or not the measures were actually effective.
Right. Testing at the airports, more than 80,000 on-arrival test results and 57,000 post-arrival test results could not be matched to the people tested. What happened?
Well, what we found here is that the department was unable to match or had missing test results in 30% of the travelers. And these are the tests, when you arrive on air and you have to do an upon arrival test, when they get the results back from the lab, they couldn't match them to a traveler and hence couldn't either inform them or confirm that all was good. Really, it fundamentally comes down to managing information and having the data that you need. And we saw an improvement in being able to contact travelers, but then I was disappointed that they didn't apply those lessons learned from the first audit in March to the new border measures here.
Right.
So it was concerning that over 1,000 travelers who tested positive were unable to be reached by the agency because they couldn't contact.
Do you consider these findings on your part? Do you consider these measures at the border to have been a failure?
So it really isn't up to me to comment on the policy decisions about what measures should be in place at the border and when they should be added or removed. It's my responsibility to look at whether or not the government has set clear expectations, that the requirements are communicated and well understood, and then that they have processes in place to monitor and then to report on the effectiveness of the measures that they've put into place. And our findings are such that they need to do a better job at that tail end of that.
All right. Let's talk about the inspections that were supposed to protect temporary foreign workers in the agriculture sector in particular and prevent the spread of COVID. 95% of the inspections, as I understand it, are done virtually. Why were those inspections a failure? And let me just jump ahead if I can. You actually pointed out the shortcomings to the government and extended your audit period to see if the inspection process would improve after you pointed it out to them. But it got worse. You waited until now, though, to say so. And I guess I'm wondering whether you think you should have reported the worsening situation sooner.
So in this audit here, we looked at the temporary foreign worker program, and I think it's important to understand the role that it plays. The temporary foreign workers fill a labor shortage in our agricultural sector, and they're a key element to Canada's food supply system. We looked at the inspections that looked at COVID measures, and as you pointed out, I spoke to the department back in December and sent them a letter, and I have to admit that I'm deeply disappointed that things worsened. But what I asked them to do back in December was to prioritize the health and safety of the temporary foreign workers instead of responding to audit recommendations and coming up with a detailed plan. I expected that they were going to take concrete action to improve the living conditions of temporary foreign workers and also to improve the quality, rigor, and timeliness of their inspections.
But that didn't happen.
Did not. No.
All right.
No, it did not.
No. You also found that pandemic programs to support the food supply did help, but what's still missing to protect the food system is a national plan for national crises such as the pandemic. What response did you get to that finding? And is the government, they promised a plan, I think it was 2009, we're still waiting.
So during our audit on protecting Canada's food system, we actually looked at 5 initiatives that were delivered by 3 different departments, and we found that they quickly provided pandemic support by leveraging existing programs and existing mechanisms. But concerning was that there was no nationwide emergency preparedness plan that covered the whole food system. So the plan that existed actually looked at the front end, which was production and processing, and really didn't consider all elements of Canada's food supply. So distribution, consumption, and what to do with excess food. And I think we're seeing all too well the importance of how the whole supply chain needs to be thought through in the time of a crisis. We're seeing it out in BC. We're seeing it in Nunavut. And really they have to sit back and think of a plan that considers, from farm all the way to fork.
Right.
And they acknowledge that they need to do that, and they will work on it.
All right. Canada's Auditor General Karen Hogan. Lots more about the reports today on our website at cpac.ca. Madam Auditor, thanks so much for your time today. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Well, here's how federal ministers reacted to the Auditor General's findings today.
This report only covers the period starting from January 2021 to June 2021. Since then, the Public Health Agency has taken a series of different steps to address the challenges and gaps the Auditor General has identified. For example, just last August, the agency has awarded more than $27 million in contracts to 4 private security firms to increase its number of agents physically following up with travelers required to quarantine.
Since the end of the audit, we've seen some improvement. I, too, like Mr. Duclos, have given some very specific deliverables to my deputy minister around what I expect to see when it comes to supplemental training for staff, a process to be put in place if a worker signals that they are in distress or danger, with respect to closing out files, having a standard that by March 80% of them will be full and complete, and by September 90% of them. So we've got some very specific deliverables that I expect to be met.
Well, Canadians are already seeing significant increases in the cost of basic food staples. They've jumped by about 4% in 2021. But a new study out today says Canadian families are about to get slammed with even higher prices in the coming year. Get set to pay 5 to 7% more, or an extra $966 a year for the grocery bill for a typical family of 4. Dairy prices will rise by between 6 and 8%. Restaurant meals will jump by the same amount. Baked goods, 5 to 7% increase this year. The same with this coming year. Same with vegetables. Expect to pay between 3 and 5% more for fruit. Expect smaller increases of up to 2% for meat and seafood. Canada's Food Price Guide was prepared by researchers from Dalhousie University and the universities of Guelph, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. Sylvain Charlebois is the lead author of the report and a professor of food distribution and policy at Dalhousie University in Halifax. He's with me now. Monsieur Charlebois, thanks for taking time to speak with me. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
This is the highest food price increase ever predicted in your annual report on prices. So what's behind the big spike in food prices? Give us some clarity here.
Yeah, so generally we're looking at a global phenomena. A lot of people may think this is just about Canada. It is not. We're seeing food inflation becoming a problem in many parts of the world, and so Canada is not immune to, say, problems we're seeing with supply chains. Mm-hmm. Supply chains are much lower, and when you slow things down with supply chains, it ends up costing more. So that's one reason. The other reason is labor. A lot of people may underappreciate the fact that when you actually increase wages, which is exactly what's happening in many parts of the supply chain. We just saw High River settle for 21% over 6 years last week. Many plants have actually are now offering higher wages. In a high volume, low margin environment, you have to adjust prices. So it's really putting a lot of pressure on retail prices. And the last one is input costs. Input costs are more expensive ingredients. So grains, barley, wheat, canola, all these products are more expensive. So to feed livestock and to produce food are costing more.
Why will some prices jump more than others? For instance, dairy products jumping by as much as 8%.
There's always a lag for certain commodities. So last year or this year in 2021, we saw the meat counter being a problem. I mean, we saw chicken prices, pork prices, and beef prices in particular go up just because the lag is much shorter. For chicken, it's very short. So we saw an increase of 13%. Pork is a little bit longer, 4 or 5 months. Beef is 8 months. But when beef goes up, it goes up for a while. And that's kind of what has happened. With dairy, the reason why dairy is really the one place where we're likely to see a lot of many increases is because the Canadian Dairy Commission, which is a Crown corporation, has to provide a recommendation once a year. And that happened just before November 1st of this year, and it will actually start on February 1st. So farmers will get more money for their work, but those increases will work their way through the supply chain within weeks after February 1st.
You talked about the supply chain issues from the pandemic disruptions globally, in some cases caused by weather events, such as the floods we've seen in BC. That has an impact on prices too. How long should we expect those supply chain issues to persist?
Well, it's going to last a while. Restarting the global economy is like steering a cruise ship with paddles. It takes longer. We'll get the destination, but it will take longer. And right now, the biggest problem we're seeing right now is that the entire global economy is just not synchronized. Some parts are doing well while others are struggling. Look at Europe right now. Europe is burning with COVID. So that's why things have slowed down, and that's going to last a while, at least 6 months. So we are expecting things to calm down by the time we get to the fall of 2022, but we never know. Right. Something else can happen.
The report also points to the growing role that food waste is playing in higher prices. What's the connection?
Well, food waste, when you think about it as a consumer, food waste is really the one bill you never get, but you still have to pay because you buy stuff and you buy food, but you never benefit from it due to poor inventory skills, maybe due to the fact that you don't want to eat leftovers and things like that. So waste really becomes a problem, and because of the fact that supply chains are much slower, people are actually probably wasting more because they're buying products that are much older and their shelf life has been shortened just because products have been hanging around on a train or on a boat or in a truck for much longer than usual.
Okay, look at what's the challenge here for policymakers? We talk about a lot of that on this channel. You're on the policy side as well. So what is it governments could or should be doing here to deal with the spike in food prices and the effects of that, or is there much they can do?
Actually, there is. So for one, the focus shouldn't be food prices. Obviously, we do make projections on food prices, but the biggest challenge for Canada, I think, is food affordability. So when you see the inflation rate go up, that's one thing, but if wages aren't moving along, that is a problem. In fact, the UN, every year the UN publishes an index on food affordability. In 2020, Canada ranked 18th. It wasn't 150th, it wasn't first, it was 18th. So not bad, but we've gone down in the rankings. We're now number 24. And we're expecting to drop even further in 2022. That's really something that government should be looking into. How much money people are making, how much money they are keeping after taxes, so they can afford to live well.
All right, lots to watch. And pardon the pun, food for thought today from Sylvain Charlebois and his group in this report. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon.
My pleasure.
Well, I'm joined now by our panel of political commentators. Mira Ahmad is a Liberal commentator, Andrew Bramber is a Conservative commentator, and Anne McGrath is the National Director of the New Democratic Party. Good to see you all. Mira, let me start with you. There's the ongoing debate over inflation, food prices skyrocketing. A new report on that out today. Housing prices out of reach for many Canadians, especially younger Canadians. The House debate today debating a motion, a Conservative motion on the housing crisis. And I guess I'm wondering, what should Canadians expect from their policymakers in terms of mitigating the effects of the rising cost of living?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, certainly the rising cost of food and housing, the studies published today predicting the 5 to 7% increase is extremely concerning for Canadians and for folks around the world. This is a challenge that isn't unique to Canada. Countries around the world, including the United States, are more and more experiencing the impacts of COVID-19 as they relate to similar rates of inflation and rising costs. We're not out of the woods yet with COVID-19. It will get better, but climate change, on the other hand, is getting worse. And the reality of climate-driven inflation is going to continue. So, this government's plan to move forward on $10 a day childcare, putting home ownership back in reach and cutting taxes, taking bolder climate action is going to help us fight this and make life more affordable. I think it's important to add, the Conservatives have been very quick to blame the government policies on high inflation and the rise of food costs. But the reality is that these rising costs aren't a result of the government's fiscal policies. Okay. They're tied to the pandemic and global supply chain disruptions and climate change as well.
All right, Andrew, look, rising inflation, outstripping wage increases, Canadians losing ground here. What's the right response from government?
Well, I think the right response is certainly not saying, "Oh, well, the pandemic's going on, so we're just going to have to deal with these rising prices of everything." Quite frankly, it's been a long 24 months. People have been brought to their wits' end in terms of their stress levels and anxiety. And now, in addition to that, they're having to worry even more about what's in the bank account at the end of the day. And as these reports signal, it's not slowing down. Next year, it's going to be even worse. And so I think what we would, first of all, I love the fact that we're actually having a debate on this finally, and actually talking about it. And I think what we need to see from policymakers is a commitment to study it more deeply and actually start taking some measures around providing some relief. And relief isn't in the form of taking it out of one envelope and putting it back in another. So making childcare more affordable for people is not going to help lower the price of their grocery bill at the end of the day.
Well, we hear lots of solutions, and earlier on my program we heard from a food expert, in fact the lead researcher on the food price study out today, that the focus should be on food affordability. So if costs are rising, buying power should keep pace. For instance, incomes and taxation at levels that allow families to keep pace with rising food prices that they don't control. So where do you think the solutions lie?
Well, I think that, first of all, I think that there is kind of got to be a holistic look at this. I don't think that you can say, as the Conservatives have, that this is purely a problem that has been driven by the spending on the pandemic. And I think that they may be trying to set up calls for austerity or those kinds of things. But, the spending on the pandemic was necessary, in my view. Not just in my view. I mean, people needed those supports. And we're actually obviously very worried about things like the GIS clawback and other things in the bill that looks like it's trying to end some of those pandemic support. So it can't just all be laid at the feet of the pandemic spending. On the other hand, it is also not right to say that the government doesn't have some ability to do some things about this, and they do. Housing affordability was mentioned. That is a huge driver of inflation. With respect to groceries, I think groceries are everybody experiences that. People who are doing very well might not notice as much as others how much the price of things have gone up, but it is very noticeable for all of us who go to the grocery store to buy groceries. It's very noticeable.
It's going to be $1,000 more for groceries in the coming year. I think everybody's going to notice.
That is very, very noticeable. And the answer there cannot be like so on food prices. I mean, there's a variety of things that can happen, but one thing I know is that consumers are feeling the squeeze. It's not workers who are reaping the benefits of that, the workers in the grocery stores who are deemed essential during the pandemic. But, we do have some major grocery chains who are doing very, very well.
Lots to cover on this in days ahead. And the debate is sort of fully fueled now, I think. Mira, the Auditor General's report came out today pointing out in no uncertain terms the failings of the government and its agencies on border measures that they've been taking during the pandemic. Testing at airports, mandatory quarantines, they can't demonstrate they're actually effective because so much information is missing and can't be tracked down. What's your reaction to those findings, and how much confidence should Canadians have in the government's handling of the border?
I'll start by saying I think, this government has always been the first to say that things can be better. We know the pandemic took everybody by surprise. This is a once-in-a-generation health crisis that created major challenges and is continuing to challenge every single Canadian across the country. Measures were implemented by the federal government quickly to provide immediate support to ensure as many people as possible were kept safe. And I think Canadians recognize that the government did their best. And when you're in a crisis, decisions need to be made quickly. If they're not, you're vulnerable, and the decision might not be made in time. So certainly not perfect. The Auditor General has an incredibly important responsibility, and I expect the government to welcome the feedback and to implement changes to the respect of the feedback that was given.
Andrew, what are your thoughts on what the Auditor General had to say today?
Look, I agree with Mira. I think there's, there a lot of Canadians are willing to cut the government a bit of slack for what was, we were unprepared for a pandemic. The problem with this is that the pandemic's not over, and we're facing the exact same problems today with questions we see in recent days around what is being implemented at the border. So my concern is obviously these are very troubling serious numbers. Just looking at them very quickly here, 75% of travelers who flew into Canada, they're not sure if they stayed at quarantine hotels or not. 14% of people who tested positive weren't even informed that they had been tested positive. How can we have any confidence that these errors have been resolved between the time the Auditor General looked at it and today? And that's the bigger concern that the government actually has to answer for today.
Let me to close out here. Let me hear you on this. And also on the issue of temporary foreign workers, the Auditor General found not only was the inspection process at their living quarters, designed the inspection process to make sure they were protected against COVID-19 and spread, that the safety regulations were essentially ignored. She warned them, gave them a chance to make it better, and it got worse. What are we supposed to make of that?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I do think that there has been a kind of a haphazard and inconsistent approach to border and travel, and just the travel ban that's in place now that doesn't actually impact the countries where the newest variant was actually first found. So I think that there is a lot to be said about the border, and I think that she made some really, really good points about that. With respect to temporary foreign workers, you're absolutely right. Like and she's right. That what happened there was scandalous, and as we were going through different stages of the virus and looking at places where it was really running rampant, you could see that it was in places like the Cargill meat processing plant in Alberta, or some of the places in the Peel region outside Toronto, Brampton, and other places in the Peel region, where there are a lot of, there are a lot of racialized workers working in very tight quarters and very difficult conditions, and there was like a breeding ground for the virus to spread. Right. So I think, and there were a lot of people who were pointing that out, but there were not measures that were being taken around that. So Amazon continued to get their profits, but workers continued to get sick.
All right. Time is short tonight. Wish we had more of it. But Mira, Andrew, and Anne, thank you all for giving me your perspectives this evening, and take care. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
Good evening, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen, and from all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching.